The hospital's north helipad had been quiet for 6 months, deemed structurally unsafe after engineers found stress fractures in the support columns. The director, Margaret Voss, had rejected 3 repair proposals, each time citing budget constraints while approving renovations for her executive suite. She'd built her reputation on efficiency metrics, on trimming what she called operational excess. Personnel fell into that category. Michael Chen had worked pediatric oncology for 11 years, every shift a study in controlled heartbreak. His daughter Emma was 7, and after his wife died during Emma's birth, the hospital's flexible scheduling had made single parenthood possible. He'd missed exactly 4 shifts in 11 years, all documented medical emergencies. But the new efficiency metrics didn't account for loyalty or the way children in treatment asked specifically for him, or how he knew which kids needed silence and which needed stories. Voss had called him into her office on a Tuesday morning, her desk positioned to make visitors face the window's glare. The termination papers cited scheduling unreliability and failure to meet evolving institutional standards. He'd asked about the 4 absences. She'd replied that the hospital was moving toward optimal resource allocation. He'd cleaned out his locker by noon, said goodbye to the kids who were awake, left notes for those who weren't. Security escorted him through the main lobby, standard procedure that felt deliberately humiliating. Emma was at school. He'd have to tell her tonight that they'd need to find new insurance, that the job that had barely covered rent was gone. He was crossing the parking lot when he heard it, that distinctive sound that makes veterans' spines straighten involuntarily. The Seahawk came in low from the northeast, navy gray against October clouds, its approach vector all wrong for a medical transport. It circled once, rotors beating the air into submission, then descended toward the closed north helipad. Michael stopped walking. The structural warnings meant nothing to a military pilot in an emergency. Someone had cleared that landing, someone with authority that superseded hospital administration. The Seahawk touched down with the precision that comes from aircraft carrier decks in rough seas. The door slid open before the rotors finished spooling down. The jumpmaster who emerged wore dress blues, not flight gear. Behind him a stretcher, but the Marines carrying it moved with ceremony, not urgency. This wasn't a medevac. This was something else entirely. Michael watched from the parking lot as Margaret Voss appeared at the hospital's entrance, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something approaching fear. The Marine officer walked directly toward her, his bearing suggesting this conversation would not be about budget allocations. The officer's name tape read Sullivan, and he carried himself with the particular authority of someone who'd earned rank in places where mistakes cost lives. He stopped 3 feet from Voss, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly, and produced a military identification card that caught the gray morning light. Margaret Voss, for all her administrative confidence, seemed to shrink incrementally. Michael couldn't hear the conversation from across the parking lot, but he could read body language fluently after years in pediatric wards where parents communicated entire novels of grief without words. Sullivan wasn't asking. He was informing. Voss gestured toward the helipad, her movements sharp with the kind of anger that comes from losing control of a situation. Sullivan didn't acknowledge the gesture. He simply waited, the way career military wait, with infinite patience that somehow conveys absolute intransigence. After a moment, Voss pulled out her phone, made a call. Her free hand moved in agitated punctuation. She ended the call, said something brief. Sullivan nodded once and turned back toward the Seahawk. The Marines had already unloaded their cargo, the stretcher now resting on the helipad's concrete. But it wasn't a patient. As Michael watched, they unfolded what appeared to be a flag-draped transfer case. His breath caught. A military funeral detail at a civilian hospital could mean only one thing. Someone had died in care, someone whose service entitled them to honors that transcended institutional policy. The hospital's medical staff began emerging from various entrances, drawn by the helicopter's presence. Nurses, doctors, technicians, all standing in uncertain clusters. They'd worked around the closed helipad for months, used to its absence. Now it held a scene that demanded attention. Sullivan spoke into a radio, brief and professional. The Seahawks pilot remained at the controls, rotors still turning at idle, ready for immediate departure if needed. This wasn't a delivery. This was a statement. Michael's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, then recognized the area code as base adjacent. A woman's voice, crisp with military precision. "Is this Michael Chen?" he confirmed. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park, Naval Medical Center, San Diego. I'm trying to reach you regarding Captain James Morrison. You're listed as his emergency contact for civilian coordination." The name hit like pressure change. Morrison. Jimmy Morrison. They'd served together on the Roosevelt, different departments but same deployment, same months of flight operations in the Persian Gulf. They'd stayed in touch sporadically, the way veterans do, annual messages that carried weight beyond their brevity. "Jimmy's dead." Michael's voice came out flat, the tone he used when delivering unbearable news to parents when emotion would make truth harder to bear. "3 days ago," Park said, "pancreatic cancer, moved fast. He'd been receiving treatment at your facility for the past 6 months." Michael's mind raced backward. 6 months. The timeline aligned with budget cuts, with Voss's efficiency initiatives, with the helipad closure. "He left specific instructions," Park continued, "regarding his care, his final arrangements, and certain personnel matters. Captain Morrison was very clear about who had provided competent treatment and who had interfered with it. The Navy takes care of its own, Mr. Chen. We also remember those who failed our people." The pieces assembled themselves with awful clarity. Morrison had been oncology, Michael's department, but Michael had been there for only part of that timeline before Voss's termination. "The helipad," he said. "Captain Morrison specifically requested his remains be retrieved from your facility via the North Helipad. He was aware of its closure status. He wanted his final departure to make a point about institutional priorities." Michael looked back toward the hospital entrance where Voss stood frozen, watching the Marines prepare the honor detail. The flag's red and white stripes moved slightly in the rotor wash. "There's more," Park said. Captain Morrison documented extensive concerns about care quality degradation under current administration. He submitted a formal complaint to Naval Medical Command 2 weeks before he died. "The investigation is ongoing, but Mr. Chen, you should know that he specifically cited your termination as evidence of systemic failure." His words were quite strong. Sullivan had produced a tablet, was showing Voss something on the screen. Her face had gone pale, visible even at this distance. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "Now," Park said, "the Navy conducts a full review of Captain Morrison's care. Any facility treating active duty or retired military personnel is subject to our standards. Failures have consequences. Also, Mr. Chen, Captain Morrison left something for you. Instructions, actually. He seems to have anticipated certain developments." The Marines had formed up, 6 of them, regulation spacing and bearing. The flag detail prepared to move. "What kind of instructions?" "He wanted you to know that competent medical personnel are always needed. Naval Medical Center San Diego has an opening in pediatric oncology. The pay grade matches your experience. Housing assistance included. If you're interested, I'm authorized to begin processing immediately." Michael watched the honor guard lift the transfer case with synchronized precision. 11 years at this hospital, and it took a dead captain to reveal what mattered beyond efficiency metrics. "I have a daughter," he said. "Excellent schools near the base," Park replied without hesitation. "We take care of families, Mr. Chen. It's not just a slogan." The Marines began their slow march toward the Seahawk, movements ritualized and ancient. Voss had backed away from Sullivan, who remained motionless, bearing witness rather than participating. The hospital staff watched in silence, that particular quiet that accompanies military honors, when even civilians recognize something sacred. "I'm interested," Michael said. "Very interested. I'll send the paperwork within the hour. Captain Morrison also left a personal message for you. He said to tell you that the kids in Ward 6 would understand, that you taught him what courage looked like, and that good people shouldn't waste time in places that measure worth by numbers instead of lives." Michael's throat tightened. Ward 6 had been Morrison's primary location, the isolation unit for the most fragile cases. Jimmy had spent months there, fighting with the same discipline he'd brought to carrier operations, and he'd watched Michael work, had understood what the job actually meant. The honor guard reached the Seahawk. The Marines loaded the transfer case with ceremonial care, then stood at attention. Sullivan saluted, holding it as the flag disappeared into the aircraft. One by one, the hospital staff began saluting too, the veterans among them finding reflexes they hadn't used in years. Even some civilians raised uncertain hands, recognizing the moment demanded participation. Sullivan's salute snapped down. He walked to the Seahawk, paused at the door, and looked directly at Michael across the parking lot. The distance was too great for eye contact, but the gesture was clear. A nod. Acknowledgement. Then he was aboard, and the Seahawk's rotors increased pitch, lifting the aircraft with the same precision it had brought for landing. It turned northwest, toward the ocean, carrying Jimmy Morrison home. The helipad settled into silence. Voss stood alone near the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Michael had seen that look before, on the faces of parents who just realized they'd made a terrible mistake, that some decisions couldn't be unmade. The hospital's silence lasted perhaps 30 seconds before phones began ringing, before the administrative machinery lurched into motion with the grinding urgency of an institution realizing it was under scrutiny. Michael walked back toward the entrance, not because he had business there anymore, but because his truck was parked in the staff lot and he needed to collect Emma from school in 3 hours. He'd need that time to figure out how to explain that they were moving to San Diego, that sometimes terrible things led to necessary changes. Voss saw him approaching and actually took a step backward, a reflexive movement that spoke volumes about how quickly power dynamics could shift. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Mr. Chen, I think there may have been—" "Don't," he said quietly, walking past her toward the parking lot. "Just don't." Behind him, he heard Sullivan's voice carried on memory rather than air. "We take care of our own." Jimmy Morrison had taken care of his people even in death, had turned his final departure into a lesson about priorities and consequences. The North Helipad, closed for budget reasons while executive suites received Italian marble, had served one last time as a platform for truth. Michael sat in his truck for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the strange mixture of grief and relief and anger that came with understanding how the past 6 months had been less random than they'd seemed. His phone buzzed again. Parks promised paperwork, arriving with military efficiency. The Naval Medical Center position came with a salary that would actually cover rent and Emma's needs. The housing assistance wasn't charity but recognition that people who worked with dying children deserved stability. The relocation timeline was flexible but ready to accommodate immediate need. At the bottom of the email, a separate attachment, personal message from Captain James Morrison. Michael opened it. Jimmy's words were brief, recorded 2 weeks before his death when he must have known the timeline was short. "Mike, if you're reading this, then the Navy's finally gotten its act together, and Voss has learned that efficiency metrics don't mean shit when you're measuring the wrong things. You taught me how to talk to scared kids. You sat with me during the bad treatments when you should have been off shift. You fought that bureaucrat every time she tried to cut corners on care. Good people leave bad systems, Mike. It's not failure, it's survival. Take the San Diego job. Raise Emma somewhere that values what you do. And tell the kids in pediatric oncology that Captain Morrison says they're braver than any pilot who ever walked a carrier deck. He'd know. He met a few thousand of us." The message ended there, no dramatic conclusion, just Jimmy Morrison being himself. Direct, clear, unsentimental in a way that somehow carried more emotion than poetry could. Michael saved the file and sat watching the hospital's main entrance, where nurses and doctors were returning to their shifts, where the machine of institutional care continued grinding forward because sick children didn't care about administrative drama. He'd miss this. The building, the routines, the specific kids whose treatments he'd followed for years. But Jimmy was right. Good people left bad systems. It wasn't defeat. It was choosing to preserve something worth preserving. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma's school. Early dismissal today. Weather advisory. Please pick up by 2 p.m. Michael checked the sky. Gray clouds moving in from the Pacific, the kind that brought cold rain and made October feel like winter's preview. He had 40 minutes. Enough time to drive through the coffee shop where Emma liked the hot chocolate that came with miniature marshmallows. Enough time to plan how to tell a 7-year-old that life was about to change completely. He started the truck, pulled out of the parking lot, and didn't look back at the hospital. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the North Helipad, empty again but somehow different now. It had held truth for 15 minutes, had served as a stage for consequences, and that was worth more than the 6 months it had sat unused while budgets were balanced and metrics were optimized. The radio played generic morning programming, cheerful voices discussing weather and traffic as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Michael turned it off. Some drives needed silence. Emma would have questions. She always did. She'd want to know why they were moving, why he'd lost his job, why things couldn't just stay the same. He'd tell her about Captain Morrison, about service meaning something beyond the moment, about how sometimes the right choice looked like failure until you gave it time to develop into something else. She'd understand. She was 7, but she'd grown up in hospitals, around sick kids and difficult news. She knew that life didn't follow neat trajectories. The coffee shop appeared on the right, its sign promising warmth and sugar and temporary comfort. Michael pulled into the drive-through lane behind 3 other vehicles and waited his turn, watching the clouds darken overhead and thinking about helipads and honor guards, and the way some people measured worth by what they could count, while others measured it by what counting could never capture. Emma's school sat on a hill overlooking the city, surrounded by playing fields that turned muddy in fall rain and perfect in spring sunshine. Michael parked in the pickup zone and watched children emerge in clusters, their backpacks oversized, and their voices carrying that particular frequency that made patience both necessary and difficult. Emma appeared near the middle of the pack, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail that had survived maybe half the school day before loosening into casual chaos. She saw his truck and her face brightened with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made every difficult moment of single parenthood worth surviving. She climbed into the passenger seat, struggled briefly with the seatbelt, then noticed the hot chocolate in the cup holder. Her eyes widened. "It's not Friday," she said, suspicious of unexpected treats. "No," Michael agreed, pulling out of the parking lot. "It's Tuesday. Tuesday isn't hot chocolate day. Did something happen?" 7 years old and already reading context like a professional, he'd have to work on his poker face. "Something happened," he confirmed. "Good something or bad something?" She clutched the hot chocolate but didn't drink yet, waiting for clarity before accepting comfort. "Both," he said honestly. "I lost my job today." Her face fell immediately. "Because of me? Because you had to leave when I was sick?" "No, because my boss cared more about numbers than people. But Emma, something else happened." "Remember Uncle Jimmy, Captain Morrison?" She nodded slowly. Jimmy had visited twice during his treatment, had brought Emma a stuffed eagle wearing a tiny flight suit. "He died a few days ago." "Oh," small voice. She'd met death before, understood its permanence better than most children her age. "I'm sorry, Daddy. He left me a message and a job offer in San Diego near the Navy base. Better pay, better support. I think we should take it." Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching the city slide past. "Will I have to leave my school?" "Yes." "Will you be happier there?" The question caught him unprepared. Adults didn't usually ask each other that directly. "I think so. I think we both will be." She considered this, then finally sipped the hot chocolate. "Okay, but I want to say goodbye to Mrs. Patterson." Mrs. Patterson taught 2nd grade with the kind of patience that suggested she'd been teaching since education was invented. "We'll make sure you can say goodbye to everyone who matters." The apartment they'd called home for 7 years occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had been optimistically called vintage when they'd moved in and had since descended into needs work. Michael had never had time or money for work. Now he wouldn't need either. They'd be gone in weeks, maybe less if Park's paperwork moved with the speed military administration could sometimes achieve. Emma went straight to her room, not sulking but processing, giving herself space to adjust. Michael stood in the kitchen that barely fit two people and looked at the calendar on the refrigerator. Doctor appointments, school events, the careful architecture of a life built around Emma's needs and his work schedule. All of it obsolete now, replaced by a future that was simultaneously terrifying and necessary. His phone rang. Unknown number again, but he'd learned today that unknown numbers carried weight. Michael Chen. Mr. Chen, this is Admiral Richard Preston, Naval Medical Command West. Michael straightened reflexively, the posture adjustment pure instinct. Yes, sir. I won't keep you. I'm calling to personally extend our offer and to tell you that Captain Morrison's final report made clear the caliber of care you provided and the obstacles you faced providing it. The Navy doesn't forget that. We're conducting a full investigation of that facility's treatment of military patients. There will be consequences for institutional failures. The Admiral's voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of service, from making decisions that affected thousands of lives. More importantly, Mr. Chen, we need people like you, people who remember that medicine is about patients, not metrics. San Diego would be fortunate to have you. Your daughter would be fortunate to grow up in a community that values what you do. Michael found his voice. Thank you, sir. Captain Morrison was a good man. He was. And he trusted you enough to make his death mean something. That's not a small thing. We'll be in touch with final details shortly. Welcome aboard, Mr. Chen. The call ended. Michael stood holding his phone, trying to process how a morning that had started with termination had transformed into something else entirely. Through the wall, he heard Emma moving around her room, probably deciding which stuffed animals could make the trip to San Diego and which would have to stay behind. 7 years old and already learning about necessary sacrifices, about how life required periodic pruning to grow toward light. The afternoon dissolved into logistics, into searching San Diego housing markets online and calculating drive times from Naval Medical Center to schools with good ratings. Emma emerged eventually, carrying the stuffed eagle that Jimmy Morrison had given her. "Can we visit Captain Morrison's grave?" she asked. "When we move, I mean, can we bring flowers?" Michael pulled her into a hug. "Yes, definitely yes." "Good. He was nice to me even when he felt bad. That's important." Out of the mouths of children came truth that adults spent years learning to articulate. "Very important," Michael agreed. The evening news played in the background, local stories about traffic and weather and politics. Nothing about helicopters or hospital confrontations or the way institutions sometimes needed public reckoning to remember their purpose. That story would break later, after naval investigations finished their work and journalists found sources willing to talk. But tonight it was just Michael and Emma, eating takeout pizza at their small kitchen table and discussing which of her drawings should be packed carefully and which could be photographed and recycled. "Daddy," she said between bites, "will there be other kids like me at the new place, with parents who work at the hospital?" "Lots of them. It's a military community. Families take care of each other." "That's good. I'm tired of explaining why you're busy all the time." Michael laughed, surprised by the sound after today's emotional gauntlet. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." Later, after Emma was asleep, Michael stood at their apartment's single window and looked out at the city lights spreading toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Margaret Voss was probably still on the phone, probably still trying to understand how quickly authority could evaporate when someone with real power decided to ask questions. Somewhere out there, Jimmy Morrison's body was being prepared for burial with military honors, his service to be recognized by people who understood what service meant. And somewhere between those 2 points, a pediatric oncology ward full of scared kids would wake tomorrow missing a nurse who'd always known their names and their fears and which stories they needed to hear. But Mike Chen wouldn't be there. He'd be here, packing boxes and planning a future that honored what Jimmy Morrison had believed about worth and value, and the importance of systems that supported good people instead of grinding them down. The next 3 weeks moved with surprising speed. pulled forward by military logistics and Emma's adaptability, and the strange clarity that comes from knowing a decision is necessary even when it's difficult. Park's paperwork proved flawless, comprehensive enough to anticipate questions before they arose. The housing assistance connected them with a duplex 10 minutes from both the medical center and a highly rated elementary school. The moving company the Navy contracted handled everything with efficiency that made civilian services look amateur. Michael gave his notice to the landlord, who seemed unsurprised. "Lot of people moving out of state," he said. "Cost of living's gotten ridiculous." Michael didn't correct him. The truth was more complicated than economics, but economics made an acceptable shorthand. Emma's goodbye party at school involved cupcakes and tears and promises to video chat that they'd probably keep for a few months before life pulled everyone in different directions. Mrs. Patterson hugged Emma hard and told Michael quietly that his daughter was resilient and bright and would thrive anywhere. But especially, she added, somewhere that values her father's work. News about the hospital investigation broke during their last week in the city. Local media covered it with the breathless tone reserved for institutional scandal. Naval investigators had found systematic patterns of care degradation, budget prioritization that violated standards for military patient treatment, and documentation of administrative interference with medical decisions. Margaret Voss had been placed on administrative leave pending further review. The hospital board had issued a statement about commitment to excellence and cooperation with investigations, the kind of corporate language that meant lawyers were involved and liability was being calculated. Michael watched the news coverage with Emma eating cereal beside him, too young to fully understand but old enough to recognize her father's vindication. "Is that the lady who fired you?" she asked, pointing at Voss's picture on screen. "That's her. She looks sad." "Probably is." "Good," Emma said with a child's uncomplicated sense of justice, then returned to her cereal. Michael couldn't quite share her satisfaction. Voss had made terrible decisions, had prioritized wrong things, had hurt people through bureaucratic violence. But she was still a person, probably still believed she'd been acting reasonably. The gap between intention and impact could swallow careers and lives, and recognizing that didn't require forgiveness, but did require acknowledgement that most damage was done by people who thought they were solving problems. The drive to San Diego took 7 hours with stops for bathroom breaks and snacks, and Emma's need to examine every interesting rock formation along the highway. They arrived in late afternoon, the Pacific visible as strips of blue between buildings, the air tasting different than it had up north, somehow cleaner or maybe just unfamiliar enough to seem that way. The duplex exceeded expectations, which Michael had learned to keep low regarding military housing. 2 bedrooms, actual space in the kitchen, a small backyard where Emma could play without constant supervision. Their furniture fit strangely in new rooms, like old friends visiting in unfamiliar contexts, but within days the strangeness faded into routine. Emma's new school started the following Monday. Michael walked her to the classroom, introduced himself to her teacher, and made it halfway to the parking lot before the familiar anxiety kicked in. Was she okay? Would she make friends? Had he done the right thing uprooting her entire life? His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "Mr. Chen, this is Commander Park. Welcome to San Diego. Your orientation begins tomorrow at 800. Building 3, 3rd floor. Look forward to working with you." Military punctuality meant show up 15 minutes early, which meant leaving by 700, which meant having Emma at her before-school program by 6:30. The logistics were manageable. Everything was manageable when systems were designed to support rather than exploit. That night, Emma asked about Captain Morrison's grave again. Michael promised they'd visit that weekend, that they'd bring flowers like she'd wanted. What kind of flowers did he like? She asked. Michael realized he didn't know. "We'll bring sunflowers," he said. "They're bright and brave, that seems right." Emma considered this seriously. "Okay, sunflowers, and I want to bring the eagle he gave me, so he knows I kept it." "He'll know," Michael said, though of course Morrison was beyond knowing anything. But ritual mattered, and teaching Emma that remembering mattered more than convenience or efficiency was worth the weekend trip. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that made California weather seem artificially perfect. Michael dropped Emma at school, drove to Naval Medical Center San Diego, and found Building 3 without difficulty, because military complexes were laid out with navigational logic that civilians never quite managed. Commander Park turned out to be mid-40s, carrying herself with the precise efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years making healthcare work within military constraints. She shook Michael's hand with a grip that suggested weights and regular PT. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Chen. Let me show you what actual support infrastructure looks like." The pediatric oncology ward occupied the fourth floor of Building 5, connected to the main hospital by an enclosed walkway that provided weather protection and, Michael suspected, psychological transition space for families moving between hope and treatment. The ward itself was brighter than his previous workplace, better equipped, staffed by people who moved with the purposeful calm that comes from adequate resources and institutional backing. Park introduced him to the team leads, walked him through protocols that actually prioritized patient care over billing codes, and explained the support system that included counseling for staff dealing with the emotional weight of pediatric oncology. "We lose kids," Park said bluntly. "Not often, but we do. When that happens, we take care of the people who cared for them. Mandatory counseling, flexible scheduling, whatever's needed. Burned-out medical staff make mistakes. We prevent burnout." Michael felt something in his chest unknot, tension he'd carried so long he'd stopped noticing its weight. "That's not how my last facility operated." "I know, I read Morrison's report. Your old director confused efficiency with effectiveness. Common mistake among administrators who have never done frontline work." She paused. "You'll find this different. Better funded, better supported, better led, but still hard. These kids are fighting battles most adults couldn't handle. We're just trying to give them fighting chances." Michael spent the rest of the day in orientation, paperwork, facility tour, meeting colleagues who welcomed him with the casual competence of professionals secure in their roles. By afternoon, he understood why Jimmy Morrison had been so specific in his recommendations. This place wasn't perfect, but it was built on fundamentally different assumptions about what mattered. He picked up Emma after school. She climbed into the truck with grass stains on her knees and a smile that suggested successful playground negotiations. "Made a friend," she announced. "Her name's Keiko. Her mom's a doctor here too." "Not a doctor," Michael corrected. "A nurse." "Same thing," Emma said with 7-year-old certainty. "You help sick people." Close enough, Michael thought, close enough. Saturday morning, they drove to Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, the military burial ground that overlooked the Pacific from Point Lomas Heights. The cemetery spread across hillsides in geometric precision, white headstones marking lives of service in rows that stretched toward the horizon. Park had provided Morrison's section and plot number. They found it after 15 minutes of walking, Emma carrying sunflowers and the stuffed eagle, Michael carrying the weight of goodbye he hadn't been able to say while Morrison lived. The headstone was standard issue, white marble with military insignia and essential information rendered in carved text. Captain James Morrison, United States Navy. Service dates, birth and death years, the simple poetry of a life reduced to facts. Emma placed the sunflowers carefully at the headstone's base, then set the stuffed eagle against the stone so it sat upright, facing out toward the ocean. "Hi, Captain Morrison," she said seriously. "It's Emma. We moved to San Diego like you wanted. My dad's working at the Navy hospital now. I brought your eagle so you'd know I took good care of it. Thank you for helping us." Michael's throat tightened. He hadn't scripted this, hadn't told her what to say. She'd figured it out herself, this small ritual of gratitude and memory. "Thank you, Jimmy," he said quietly, "for caring when it mattered, for fighting even when you knew how it would end, for making your death count for something." The wind came off the ocean, carrying salt smell and the cries of gulls. Around them, other families visited other graves, engaged in their own conversations with absence. This place held thousands of stories, thousands of lives that had been deemed worth honoring beyond their utility. "Daddy," Emma said, "do you think he can hear us?" "I think what we say here matters whether he can hear it or not," Michael replied. "Remembering is important, being grateful is important, even when the person isn't here to know it." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. She stood for another moment, then took Michael's hand. "Can we come back sometimes?" "Whenever you want." They walked back toward the cemetery entrance, leaving the sunflowers and the eagle to stand witness. Behind them, Morrison's headstone caught the morning light, one white marker among thousands, distinguished now only by fresh flowers and a small stuffed animal, tokens that said, "Someone remembered, someone cared, someone was changed by knowing you." Sunday morning, Michael woke early, made coffee, and sat at the small desk in his bedroom reviewing patient files for the coming week. The work was familiar, but the context had shifted entirely. These kids would have resources, would have doctors and nurses supported rather than stretched beyond capacity, would have families who weren't fighting bureaucracy while fighting disease. Emma appeared in his doorway, hair tangled from sleep. "Pancakes?" she asked hopefully. "Pancakes," he confirmed. They made breakfast together, Emma mixing batter with intense concentration while Michael heated the griddle and tried not to micromanage. The morning dissolved into lazy weekend rhythm, cartoons and cleaning, and a trip to the grocery store that took twice as long because Emma insisted on examining every interesting package. By afternoon, they'd settled into the kind of comfortable boredom that meant adjustment was happening, that new surroundings were becoming simply surroundings. Michael's phone buzzed with a message from Park. "Monday schedule attached. Take your time settling in. No rush on first day." But there was a rush, Michael thought. Not imposed from outside, but internal, the pull of work that mattered, of kids who needed competent care, of the knowledge that good people in good systems could actually help instead of just treading water against institutional indifference. Monday morning he arrived at Building 5 15 minutes early, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and stepped into pediatric oncology ready to begin again. The ward was already active, nurses conducting morning rounds, families in various stages of their journeys. A young girl, maybe 10, bald from chemotherapy, sat in the common area working on a jigsaw puzzle with fierce determination. She looked up when Michael entered, assessed him with the direct gaze that sick kids developed, then returned to her puzzle. No fear, no special pleading, just a kid focused on solving a problem. That was the work, Michael thought. Creating spaces where kids could focus on kid things while the adults fought the battles that needed fighting. Being competent enough that families could trust the care and human enough that kids could remember they were more than their diagnoses. "Mr. Chen," Park said, appearing beside him with coffee and a tablet. "Ready to meet your team?" "Ready," Michael said, and meant it. The morning unfolded in introductions and protocols and the careful dance of joining an established system without disrupting its rhythms. By lunch, Michael had met 12 patients, learned 6 family stories, and begun building the mental map of who needed what kind of attention. The work itself was identical to his previous facility, but the context transformed everything. Resources existed when needed. Colleagues collaborated instead of competed. Administration supported rather than hindered. By day's end, he was exhausted but not depleted, tired from work rather than from fighting to do work. Emma was waiting at school pickup, animated about art class and new friends, and the fact that Keiko's mom had invited them for dinner Friday. "Can we go?" she asked. "Definitely," Michael said. The week progressed in establishing routines, in finding rhythms that worked, in the small victories that constituted successful medical care. A child responded well to treatment. A family received good news after weeks of waiting. A teenager in long-term care finally smiled at one of Michael's terrible jokes. Friday evening they went to Keiko's house, a ranch-style home 10 minutes away where Keiko's mother, Diane, proved to be an oncologist who'd served 2 deployments in Afghanistan before joining Naval Medical Center. "Park told me about Morrison's last report," Diane said while the kids played in the backyard. "That took courage, documenting that stuff while he was dying." "He was always direct," Michael said, "even when direct was uncomfortable. The Navy needs that. Civilian healthcare needs it too. Too many people stay silent, try to work within broken systems until the systems break them. She refilled his wine glass without asking, the gesture casual but attentive. You did the right thing accepting this position. Didn't feel like I had much choice. You always have choices. You chose not to become the kind of person who accepts inadequate care because fighting it is inconvenient. That matters more than you probably realize. The evening stretched into comfortable conversation, Emma and Keiko becoming fast friends with the intensity of children who recognized kindred spirits. By the time Michael and Emma headed home, stars were visible despite city lights, the sky clear and deep. I like it here, Emma said in the truck. Me too, Michael agreed. I like it here too. Weeks became months became a season. San Diego's winter was laughably mild compared to their previous home, December bringing rain but not the bone-deep cold that made everything harder. Emma thrived at her new school, brought home art projects and good grades and stories about friends whose parents also worked at the medical center. Michael's work settled into sustainable rhythm, challenging but supported, difficult but meaningful in ways that went beyond the immediate. He thought about Morrison often, about the deliberate choice to make death count for something, to use even departure as a lesson about priorities. The investigation into the previous facility concluded in January with findings that were damning but unsurprising. Systematic care degradation, budget prioritization that violated multiple regulations, administrative interference that had directly impacted patient outcomes. Voss lost her position. The hospital board faced sanctions. The facility itself went into receivership while corrections were implemented. Michael read the reports with a mixture of vindication and sadness. People had been hurt, kids had received substandard care, all because someone had confused efficiency with effectiveness, had measured the wrong things and called it success. But the system had eventually worked, had investigated and found truth and imposed consequences. That was something. The calls started in February. Other facilities, other administrators asking about his experience, about what red flags to watch for, about how to maintain care quality under budget pressure. Michael answered honestly, shared what he'd learned, and directed them toward resources. One call came from a nurse still working at his old facility, asking advice about whether to stay or leave. That's your decision, Michael told her. But I can tell you that working in a system that supports you instead of fighting you makes every shift better. The work doesn't get easier, but everything around the work stops being an obstacle. She left 2 months later. Others followed. The facility's turnover rate became a secondary scandal, proof that institutional failure affected people beyond patients. The North Helipad, in an irony that probably would have amused Morrison, was finally repaired and reopened. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. April brought Emma's 8th birthday, celebrated with school friends and too much cake, and the kind of joy that made 8 seem like the perfect age despite all evidence that every age brought its own challenges. Emma wanted to visit Morrison's grave again, bring fresh flowers, show him a drawing she'd made of the ocean view from the cemetery. They went on a Saturday morning, the spring weather perfect and the cemetery peaceful. The stuffed eagle was gone, probably removed by groundskeepers, but the flowers they'd left in November had left a permanent mark, a slight discoloration where stems had rested against stone. Emma placed new sunflowers in her drawing, weighted down with a rock so the wind wouldn't carry it away. "Happy birthday to me, Captain Morrison," she said. "I'm 8 now. Dad says 8 is when you start understanding more complicated things. I understand that you helped us even though you were sick, and that's really brave. Thank you." Michael added his own quiet thanks, briefer this time because the words had all been said and repetition wouldn't add meaning. They walked back to the truck in comfortable silence, Emma swinging his hand and humming something from music class. "Dad," she said as they drove home, "when I grow up I want to help people like you do." "That's good," Michael said. "The world needs people who help. But not if the place I work is mean about it. Then I'll leave and find somewhere better." She said it so matter-of-factly, this 8-year-old who'd absorbed lessons about self-worth and systemic dysfunction without formal instruction. "That's very smart," Michael said. "You're a very smart kid." "I know," Emma replied without arrogance, just stating observable fact. At home, birthday festivities continued with Diane and Keiko joining them, along with two other families from Emma's school. The backyard filled with children's laughter and adult conversation, and the temporary chaos that made birthdays memorable. Michael stood at the grill flipping burgers and watching Emma play with friends, secure and happy and unconsciously demonstrating what good choices looked like. Diane appeared beside him with a beer. "You did well," she said. "Getting out when you did, choosing better for both of you." "Morrison did well," Michael corrected. "I just accepted what he offered." "He offered because he knew you'd do something with it. That's not a small thing, being worth someone's faith." Michael considered this, while burgers sizzled and children shrieked over some game that involved running and possibly rules, but definitely joy. The evening wound down into cleanup and goodbyes, Emma exhausted but satisfied, the kind of tired that came from happiness rather than stress. She fell asleep quickly, surrounded by new toys and drawings from friends. Michael stood in her doorway watching her sleep, thinking about the previous year's chaos and the current stability, and how sometimes terrible things were actually redirections toward better paths. His phone buzzed. Email from Park. FYI, received notice that previous facility has implemented new care protocols and hired a patient advocate position specifically to prevent administrative interference with medical decisions. They credited Morrison's report and subsequent investigation with forcing necessary changes. "Thought you'd want to know the ripples spread wider than just us." Michael read it twice. Jimmy Morrison's death had changed things beyond individual lives, had shifted institutional behavior, had made one facility reconsider what effectiveness actually meant. Not a bad legacy for a career aviator who'd spent his final months fighting disease with the same determination he'd brought to carrier operations. "Thank you, Jimmy," Michael said quietly to the empty hallway, to the ghost of a friend who'd turned his death into a lesson that people were actually learning. He went to bed that night thinking about legacy and meaning, and the way some people's influence extended beyond their presence, rippling outward through time and affecting people who'd never meet them but who benefited from choices they'd made when choices were hard. Summer brought new challenges at work, new kids fighting new battles, families navigating the awful terrain of serious childhood illness. Michael met each case with the competence Morrison had recognized and the support that made competence sustainable. He took vacation days without guilt, spent weekends at beaches with Emma, built a life that included but wasn't consumed by work. The one-year anniversary of his termination passed without fanfare, noted only because Emma asked if it had been a year yet and seemed pleased that time had moved them so far from those difficult days. "We're doing good here," she announced that evening. "Yeah," Michael agreed. "We are. Captain Morrison would be happy about that." "I think he would be." Emma nodded, satisfied, then returned to her book about dolphins because 8-year-olds could hold space for both profound observations and age-appropriate interests without any sense of contradiction. October brought cooler weather, deployment season for the Navy, families preparing for separations and reunions. Michael's ward saw the predictable uptick in stress, kids dealing with illness while parents dealt with military obligations. He provided care and stability, the constant presence that mattered when everything else felt uncertain. Diane invited them to Thanksgiving, a gathering of military families who'd become chosen family through proximity and shared circumstance. The dinner was loud and warm and chaotic in the best way, proof that community could be built anywhere people decided to invest in each other. "To Captain Morrison," Diane said, raising a glass during toasts, "who reminded us that looking out for our people isn't optional, it's who we're supposed to be." Everyone drank to that, veterans and civilians alike, people who understood that Morrison's final act had been service of a different kind, had been care expressed through consequences rather than comfort. Michael thought about the previous Thanksgiving, spent quietly with Emma because money had been tight and friends had been scarce. A year made all the difference when choices changed direction, when systems supported instead of ground down, when people decided that caring for each other wasn't weakness but foundation. December brought Emma's winter concert at school, her clear voice cutting through the gymnasium's terrible acoustics with a purity that made throat-tightening mandatory for parents. Afterward, she ran to Michael with unself-conscious excitement, asking if he'd heard her solo, if she'd done well, if he was proud. "Very proud," he said, hugging her tight. "Always proud." That weekend they visited Morrison's grave one more time before year's end, bringing poinsettias because December suggested festive flowers. Emma had written him a letter, carefully printed on lined paper, telling him about third grade and her friends and her solo in the concert. She left it at the headstone, tucked under the flowers where weather would eventually destroy it but sentiment would remain. "Merry Christmas, Captain Morrison," she said. "We're doing really good. Thank you for everything." They drove home through early evening darkness, Christmas lights beginning to appear on houses, the world preparing for holidays that would be spent in the life Morrison had helped them build. Not perfect, not without challenges, but fundamentally different than what they'd left behind. On Christmas Eve, after Emma was asleep and presents were arranged with parental optimism about early morning chaos, Michael sat at his desk and wrote a letter he'd been composing mentally for months. Not to Morrison, who was beyond correspondence, but to the other people at his previous facility, the nurses and doctors still fighting to provide good care in a system that was hopefully improving but probably still flawed. He wrote about what leaving had taught him, about how loyalty to institutions mattered less than loyalty to principles, about how choosing better for yourself wasn't selfishness but necessary self-preservation that let you help others from a position of strength rather than depletion. He wrote about Morrison's courage in documenting failures, about how truth-telling sometimes cost everything but created conditions for change. He wrote about Emma growing up in a place that valued her father's work, about how children learned what mattered by watching what adults chose to prioritize. He finished the letter near midnight, read it over once, then printed it and addressed it to the nurses' break room at his old facility. He didn't know if anyone would read it or if it would matter. But Morrison had taught him that speaking truth mattered regardless of immediate outcomes, that planting seeds of change was worthwhile even when you wouldn't see the harvest. Christmas morning arrived with Emma's excitement, and wrapping paper carnage and the perfect chaos of childhood joy. Michael made breakfast while Emma played with new toys, content in the knowledge that today's celebration was built on stable foundation, that the year ahead would be met from a position of security rather than constant crisis. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Merry Christmas to you and Emma. Grateful you're here." He replied with thanks and reciprocal sentiment, then pocketed the phone and returned full attention to Emma's narration of how her new art supplies would be used to create masterpieces. The morning stretched into afternoon, relaxed and unhurried. Eventually, Emma asked to watch a movie, her traditional Christmas afternoon routine. Michael queued up her choice and settled beside her on the couch, her warm presence against his side proof that good decisions, once made, continued paying dividends. On the coffee table, visible whenever Michael glanced away from the screen, sat a photo he'd framed weeks ago. Himself and Morrison from their deployment days, young and healthy and completely unaware of what futures waited. Morrison was laughing in the photo, head thrown back, the kind of joy that came from surviving another day of dangerous work with competent people. Michael had kept the photo in a drawer for years, unable to look at it after Morrison's diagnosis, then unable to discard it. Now it sat in open air, memorial and reminder both, proof that some people's influence outlasted their presence. Emma noticed it during a slow scene in the movie. "He looks happy there," she observed. "He was happy," Michael confirmed. "We were both happy. It was good work with good people." "Like now," Emma said. "Like now," Michael agreed. The movie continued, songs and animation and the predictable arc of children's entertainment. Michael found himself thinking about arcs, about the story of the past year, about how Morrison's death had triggered cascades of consequences that brought Michael and Emma to this couch, this afternoon, this stability. You couldn't plan for that. You could only recognize opportunity when it appeared and have courage to take it, even when taking it meant leaving familiar ground. By evening, Emma was tired from present excitement and sugar consumption, ready for bed earlier than usual. Michael read her 2 chapters from her current book, tucked her in, and stood in the doorway watching her settle into sleep. "Dad," she said drowsily, "Captain Morrison was a good friend to you, wasn't he?" "One of the best," Michael said. "That's good. Everyone needs friends who help them be better." 8 years old, and she understood friendship and legacy, and the ways people influenced each other toward improvement. Michael had taught her some of that, but she'd learned more from watching choices and consequences play out in real time. "Good night, Emma." "Good night, Dad. Merry Christmas." He left her door cracked the way she liked and returned to the living room where Morrison's photo caught lamplight. The letter to his old coworkers sat stamped and ready for mailing. Tomorrow he'd drop it in a mailbox and let it find whoever needed to read it. Tonight he'd sit with memory and gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd made hard choices that proved correct. The city outside was settling into Christmas night, families in various configurations celebrating or enduring depending on their circumstances. Michael thought about all the people working tonight. Doctors and nurses and essential personnel keeping systems running while others celebrated. He'd been there himself, working holidays because someone had to, because sick kids didn't recognize calendar dates. Now he had stable scheduling and holiday rotation that was fair and time to actually spend with Emma when it mattered. Simple things, really. Basic things. But their absence had made everything harder, and their presence made everything better. Around 10 o'clock he went to his own bedroom, set his alarm for morning, and lay in darkness thinking about the year ending and the year coming. Professionally he was secure, personally he was stable, and Emma was thriving. Morrison's death had catalyzed all of it, had been the stone thrown in water that created expanding ripples of change. Not fair, Michael thought. Jimmy should be alive, should be in remission, should be here to see what his final report had accomplished. But life didn't work on fairness. It worked on choices and consequences and sometimes terrible things that forced necessary change. Michael had learned to hold both truths simultaneously, grief for Morrison's loss and gratitude for what that loss had created. The alternative was bitterness or willful blindness, neither of which honored anyone or improved anything. He fell asleep thinking about helipads and honor guards, and the way institutions sometimes needed public reckoning to remember their purpose. His dreams, when they came, were peaceful. The new year arrived with traditional fanfare, celebrations and resolutions, and the collective fiction that date changes created meaningful difference. But Michael had learned that real change came from daily choices, from sustained commitment to values, from systems that supported rather than exploited. January brought new patients and ongoing cases, and the steady rhythm of work that mattered. Emma returned to school with stories about holiday adventures and plans for third-grade projects. Diane checked in regularly, friendship deepening into the kind of relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. Morrison's legacy rippled outward, visible in policy changes at Michael's old facility, in the letter responses that trickled back from nurses who were grateful someone had articulated what they'd been feeling, in the way Naval Medical Command had tightened oversight of civilian facilities treating military patients. Not revolutionary changes, but incremental improvements that would affect hundreds of families over years. That was enough, Michael thought. That was more than enough. Individual action creating systemic change, one documented report and one medical center transfer at a time. He visited Morrison's grave in late January, alone this time because Emma had a birthday party to attend and some conversations needed solitude. The cemetery was quiet, a Tuesday afternoon when most people were working. Michael stood at the headstone for a long time, not praying because he wasn't sure he believed in anyone listening, just being present with memory. "It's been good, Jimmy," he said finally. "The work, the place, Emma's thriving. You did that. Your report, your recommendation, your refusal to let them forget you mattered even while you were dying. That took courage I'm not sure I could have managed. The wind came off the ocean, constant and cleansing. I'm trying to pay it forward. Wrote to the nurses still at the old place, shared what leaving taught me. A few have already moved on to better situations. Your report keeps rippling outward, keeps creating opportunities for change. Michael paused, searching for the right words to end this one-sided conversation. I miss you. Emma misses you. But we're okay. We're more than okay. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway. For caring enough to act when action was hard. For believing I was worth supporting even when you were fighting your own battle. For showing us both that good people don't have to accept broken systems, that leaving can be strength instead of failure. He stood for another moment, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot. Behind him, Morrison's headstone stood witness to a life of service, to final choices that extended influence beyond presence. The drive back to his apartment took 30 minutes through afternoon traffic. He picked up Emma from her birthday party, listened to her excited recap of games and cake and social dynamics that mattered intensely at 8 years old. They went home and made dinner together, her helping with vegetables and commentary. The evening dissolved into homework assistance and bath time negotiations and the comfortable routines that constituted successful parenting. By 8:30, Emma was asleep, and Michael sat at his desk reviewing patient charts for tomorrow's shift. The work was challenging but not overwhelming, complex but not impossible. Systems that worked made all the difference. His phone buzzed with a message from Park. New admission tomorrow, 8-year-old with leukemia. Family just transferred here from out of state. Father's active duty. They're scared and need someone competent and kind. You're scheduled for intake. Michael confirmed receipt and made notes for morning prep. Another family, another crisis, another opportunity to provide care that actually helped instead of just processing people through inadequate systems. This was the work Morrison had believed in, had fought to make possible even while dying. Michael would meet that family tomorrow with competence and kindness, would give them reasons to trust that their child was in capable hands, would demonstrate what adequate resources and institutional support looked like in practice. Not heroic, not dramatic. Just good work done well by people who had what they needed to succeed. That was Morrison's legacy, measured in improved patient care and supported medical staff and families who didn't have to fight bureaucracy while fighting disease. Simple things, really. Fundamental things. But their presence made the difference between medicine as vocation and medicine as survival. Michael closed his laptop and stood at the window looking out at San Diego's night lights. Somewhere in that sprawl of illumination, families were fighting battles, people were making hard choices. Systems were either supporting or failing the people who depended on them. He couldn't fix everything, but he could show up tomorrow morning prepared to provide excellent care to one family, and that mattered more than grand gestures or revolutionary change. Morrison had understood that, had recognized that individual competence within functional systems created real improvement, one patient and one family at a time. The work accumulated, the ripples spread, and eventually institutional culture shifted because enough people refused to accept inadequacy as inevitable. Michael went to bed that night thinking about tomorrow's intake, about an 8-year-old facing leukemia and parents facing terror, about the privilege of being positioned to help at crucial moments. Not because he was special, but because he worked within a system that valued what he did and gave him tools to do it well. That was Morrison's final gift. Not just the job, but the understanding that context mattered as much as capability, that good people in bad systems struggled while adequate people in good systems thrived. The lesson had cost Morrison his life to teach. Michael was determined to honor it by living differently, by choosing better, by showing Emma through daily example what it looked like when principles guided choices even when choices were hard. Outside his window, the city breathed through its night rhythms, preparing for another day. Michael breathed with it, grateful and grounded and ready for whatever tomorrow brought.